Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest in our series of substantive webinars using ESS data. My name is Eric Harrison. I'm Deputy Director at European Social Survey Headquarters at City University of London. Today's papers are all on the theme of climate change beliefs or attitudes to climate change. The way that the session will work is as follows. We have 5 papers. The speakers will present for something around 20 minutes. And then at the very end of the session, after we've had all 5 presentations, we will have a panel session where the speakers will answer your questions. So as the papers proceed in their sequence, if you'd like to leave your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window and make clear to whom your question is directed, our speakers will sweep up all these questions in the final part of the session. Thanks very much. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Is Wouter Poortinga from Cardiff University. And he's going to be talking about European attitudes to climate change and energy. Wouter, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Eric. So I hope you can all see the slides for my presentation. If not, please give me a shout. Thanks very much, Eric, for chairing this session today. And also thanks to Stefan Swift, who has done most of the organizing of this seminar. So thank you very much for doing that. Now, what I would like to do in this presentation is to talk to you about European attitudes to climate change. And then in particular, I would like to talk to you about how we designed the climate change and energy module that was fielded as part of round 8 of the European Social Survey. Now something has gone wrong, so I will have to share again. Right, yeah. So to start out with, I would like to say a little bit about the background of the European Social Survey. So many of you will be familiar with it, but for those who do not know the ESS, this is a little bit of an introduction. So it is an academically driven cross-national survey conducted since 2001, and that's also the reason why we have the seminar today. So it's to celebrate the 20th year anniversary of the ESS with a slight delay because of COVID. Now, the European Social Survey provides high-quality social science data on a range of socially relevant topics. And it has very high scientific standards. So if you're looking at the organization, I would say it is second to none. Now, there's a whole infrastructure which is shown here on this slide. So there's a number of teams, committees, and forums who are involved. And then there's, of course, the participating countries who are collecting the data. Now, as part of the European Social Survey, there are typically 2 rotating modules that are designed by the question design team with the help of the central coordinating team. As I said, there's an impressive infrastructure that is there to maintain the quality and then the integrity of the survey. In terms of the survey itself, there tends to be about 1,500 respondents per country, although the smaller countries, they have a slightly smaller sample of 800 participants. But it has a strict random probability sampling. There's strict guidelines to make the data collection comparable. And a good aspect of the ESS is that all documentation and information is made available on the website. So if you want to know more about the climate change and energy module, the only thing you have to do is to go on the website and all information can be found there. Now, this is the team that was involved in the design. So it was Gisela Böhm from Bergen University. There was Stefan Fischer from Oxford University, and also Linda Stech and Lorraine Whitmars were involved in the design. Now, the topic of the module was on climate change and energy, and climate change, of course, is the biggest environmental threat the world is currently facing. What we need to do is to implement policy that is needed to avoid what is known as dangerous climate change, so defined as 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures as compared to pre-industrial levels. And there's lots of policies and roadmaps and agreements in order to achieve that. Now, unfortunately, currently there's insufficient climate pledges as mentioned on the COP26 and also as reported in the IPCC synthesis report that was published earlier this year. Now, in order to achieve the ambitious targets as set out in, for example, the Paris Agreement, we need to fundamentally change the way we live, and in particular the way we use and produce energy. Now, this applies to both energy supply and the demand of energy. Yeah, so we need to make changes to the supply, the energy supply. So we need to create new energy technologies to decarbonize that supply. But on top of that, we need to reduce energy demand. So the most important thing here is that one side is not enough. So we do need to do both in order to achieve those targets. Now, we would argue that public perceptions and attitudes are critical to achieve climate change targets. And again, it's about the supply side and demand side. Yeah, so we know that community opposition can lead to delays and cancellations of low carbon infrastructure, but also on the demand side, people are unwilling to take action when they don't see the need for it. But it's not only about the supply side and the demand side, it's also about the political willingness to make change. Yeah, so political public attitudes matter for politics. Because, you know, if policymakers don't see that their electorate is willing to make a change or support their policies, they are unlikely to take action themselves. Now, climate perceptions have been extensively studied, and that was part of the case for support for this module. And we found we have several insights on how individuals perceive and engage with a topic. Yeah, so there's a complex interplay between personal experiences and social norms, emotions, imagery, and trust, etc. Now, this research, at least in the countries where the research has been conducted, showed a consistent pattern. Yeah, so we know that there's less engagement among men, among older age groups, and those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And then there's political polarization, as we'll hear about later on in the US, but also in other English-speaking countries. Now, as I already alluded to, most of the studies in the area have been conducted in a small number, usually the same countries. Yeah, so the question here is whether the findings can be generalized to other countries and other cultural contexts. So, for example, can the political effects been found across Europe? Now, here you can see the design, the conceptual model of the climate change and energy module. There are several concepts you may recognize if you're familiar with the environmental psychology literature. So what we wanted to do here is to make use of these concepts to make comparisons between different European countries. So it's about climate change beliefs. It is about concerns about climate change, but also energy security. Then there's a number of moderators and mediators, such as personal norms, efficacy, and trust. And then outcome variables are about energy demand measures and about energy supply sources. Now, something that I think is very important to consider here is that it is quite time-consuming and also expensive, as I mentioned earlier, to design a module, for the European Social Survey. So it starts with writing a module proposal by the question design team, and we did that in May 2014. Now, these proposals are being assessed, and then in July 2014 received an outcome that we were successful in our application. Now, that sets in motion the whole process of the design, so coming up with questions, evaluations, and then start all over again. Yeah, and then by November 2015, which is more than a year later, this was discussed in consultation with national coordinators. Now, there's further data collection as part of the preparation. So there's the omnibus testing in December 2015. And then in May 2016, we did a pilot testing with a final design of the module. So here you can see that it's already more than 2 years until that stage. And then in July 2016, the final questionnaire was produced. The fieldwork happened in 2016 and 2017, and then the data was published in October 2017. So just to give you an idea, the length and the effort that has gone into the design of the module. Now, the European Social Survey takes a concept-based design model, and I have to say I learned a lot from using this particular process of designing the module on climate change and energy. So you start out with a description of the concept you want to use. So it's not that you just pick up a number of items that you've used for years yourself. So here you can see a description of efficacy beliefs, for example, consists of a number of sub-concepts, and then based on the description of the concept, you need to come up with a measure, which is, I would say, good practice for designing a new questionnaire. And then you analyze association that you would expect between those different concepts. So this is quite extensive pilot testing that we did in December 2015. That's not the only thing. So there's also cognitive interviews that are conducted in a number of countries. And then you find out how well people understand the different constructs and terminology you're using in the questionnaire. So we conducted a number of interviews in the UK, Poland, Austria, and Spain. And then you find out it's something as simple as a term of natural gas, that people have completely different understandings of that in different countries. And then, of course, you have to deal with that. So it's quite challenging to design equivalent questions that are relevant for a large number of countries and languages. And this includes language and translation issues, but also more practical and contextual issues. And it's actually quite difficult to envisage what problems will emerge and, what is not a problem at all. So, for example, it's very difficult to translate energy use into Slavic languages. It basically translates to electricity, and that is not what you want to get at. So you have to respond to that. Also, energy efficiency and energy saving are difficult to translate in certain languages. And for example, worry and concern, which was important for this particular module, there's a distinction in English, but not necessarily in other languages. So these are all things you have to think about when designing an equivalent questionnaire. Now, the module has been used extensively, and we're quite pleased with that. So there's around 50 academic publications based on the data of this particular module, but there have been more outcomes or outputs from the module because we're aware that they have been used in government reports and book chapters as well. So it's quite well used across the board, I would say. Now, then, of course, also a number of results here, some substantive aspects of the module. So if you're looking at attitudes to climate change across Europe, you can see that there's quite a spread, and that climate skepticism is more common in certain areas than in others. Concern as well is lower in countries like Israel, in Russia, and in a number of Eastern European countries, but they also are surprisingly low or relatively low in countries like the Netherlands and the UK, at least at the time of the survey. When you're looking at the concepts of personal norms, self-efficacy, and outcome expectancy, there's quite a bit of variation, and also some of them are higher than others. But here you can see that, for example, outcome expectancy is low across the board. So it's below the scale midpoint in all the countries. Yeah, so in certain countries, people may have personal norms and personal responsibility to deal with the issue. Some people feel that they have the ability to make changes, but then the expectation of it having an effect is relatively low across the board. So that's something that needs to be dealt with. Now, this paper here on climate change perceptions and their individual level determinants, this was the first paper published using the data from the module. And here we looked at a number of determinants, widely known determinants of climate perceptions, and we wanted to know the strength of their association with a range of outcomes that we included. So in terms of perceptions, but also in terms of concern about climate change. Now, we were both surprised by how consistent the results were, but also by the differences we observed. So some predictors, they are more consistent across the countries, such as self-transcendent values, political orientation, and education. But in others, there was more variation, like gender and age. But overall speaking, the effect size was smaller in Eastern European countries as compared to Northern and Western European countries, where most of the original research was conducted, so before the European Social Survey. So here, to give you an indication of that variation, so for example, with gender, you can see that it doesn't really make much of a difference in Eastern European countries like Russia and Lithuania, but then in other countries like Norway and Belgium, there's larger effects between men and women. And the same for education. So there's an effect quite across the board, but then in a few countries, the effects are non-significant. And then the same applies to political orientation. And I believe that other presenters will say a little bit more about it later on. You can see that in some countries there is an effect, whereas in others it is non-significant. And in self-transcendence values, that is quite consistent across the board. Now, the conclusion here is that designing a robust cross-national survey on climate change and energy is incredibly challenging and time-consuming. If someone would ask me, would you do it again? I would say yes, but that is also because I now know what is involved. Now, I think that round 8 of the ESS provides a great resource for studying how Europeans relate to climate change and energy, and I see this as a baseline for future studies. So I think that is a contribution of this particular module. Now, overall, when you're looking at climate change perceptions, now there is recognition that climate change is happening and caused by humans. So climate skepticism is very, very rare, with a few exceptions. But overall, you could also say that Europeans are quite relaxed about it. So concern and also efficacy beliefs, so outcome expectancy beliefs, they are relatively low. So that is something that we need to deal with. What is also important is that findings from one country do not necessarily translate into others. And there's particularly quite a large East-West divide in terms of, let's say, the levels of climate change perceptions, but also in terms of what is contributing to those perceptions. So the levels and factors, they vary substantially. And then finally, the world has changed since 2016 and 2017. And the question now is whether a repeat is necessary. So we've seen several wildfires across the world, so in Australia and Southern America, in Northern America, but also Europe. There have been protests by Extinction Rebellion, but also Fridays for Future. So the world has changed since Greta Thunberg. But then, of course, also COVID has happened. And the concern there was that it would dent, let's say, the urgency of climate change. Now, we conducted some additional research by the Climate Change Centre at Cardiff University, so the CAST Centre, the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. And here you can see that we repeated the measure several times that we developed as part of the ESS. And you can see that concern about climate change has almost doubled since 2016. But most importantly, and that is what I'm trying to show here, it has not been dented by worry about COVID-19, and it has also not been dented by worry about the cost of living crisis. And that's it for me today. So Joel and Power, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wouter. That was very useful framing of the climate change module. I think that's a very useful lead into the rest of the papers we have today. So just to remind you, if you'd like to leave a question for Wouter about any of the content of that presentation, please lodge it in the questions and answers function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we will be returning to those at the end of the session. Our second paper is from John Kenny and Stephen Fisher, and it deals with the changing politicization of climate change attitudes in Europe. So presuming John is there and is going to lead off. So John, I hand over to you.
Thanks very much. So our paper title has slightly changed from what's on the programme. So the new title we have for it is Europeans Worry, Climate Worry 2017 to 2020, Increased, Yet More Politicised. So I'll start off the presentation and then I'll pass over to Steve midway, who will continue. So as to the motivation behind the study, so we know that the grand challenge of societal decarbonisation is not made easier for governments if voters and parties are divided into climate change views. So firstly, if there's division in whether there's a problem and whether something should be done about it, then that might delay action taking place to begin with, or also once action is implemented, there's more likelihood that if there's some backlash, that it will be retracted. So in the United States, since around 2000, there's been quite strong political divisions on climate change. So people who are Republican or conservative tend to be much more climate skeptic, whereas those who are liberal or Democrat tend to be much more climate conscious. The extent of these political divisions in Europe have been more muted, but nonetheless observable, especially in Western Europe. So the more climate conscious here have been shown to be more likely to identify on the left than the right, and also vote for Green and traditional left parties, such as Social Democrats and left socialists, compared to those parties on the right, such as conservative, Christian, or populist right. Now, in this paper that we had out last year in 2022 in electoral studies, along with with some other co-authors, what we did was we used Wave 8 of the European Social Survey to look at the extent to which there are political divides in Europe at this point. So some of the key findings from this is that we found that there are differences in left-right self-placement and climate change attitudes, but that these cannot be fully accounted for by economic or cultural attitudes of respondents. And moreover, in terms of partisan divisions, Green Party voters are more climate conscious in terms of their belief and worry on climate change than other voters with similar left-right identities and political values. And also, on the other side of the spectrum, people who vote for conservative parties and populist right parties are less worried about climate change than the left-right self-placement and other political values would point to. However, as Wouter has pointed out in the previous presentation, climate salience has increased massively since 2018. So there's been a number of events in 2018 and 2019 that pushed climate change up the political agenda. So we can think of the Fridays for Future protests and Extinction Rebellion protests. We can also think about increasing prominence given to the scientific reports coming out, such as those from the IPCC, which point to an increasingly narrow window that we have if we're to limit global temperature increases to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. There's been more extreme weather events, and that have been attributed in public discourse to climate change. And also there have been record temperature increases recorded. There's been some evidence that this has been having some sort of an impact for publics, such as increases in certain countries in people voting for Green parties, and some evidence from public opinion polls that climate change went up in people's agendas. However, what we're interested here is whether this increased salience of climate change that is observed since the Wave 8 European Social Survey module was fielded might have altered any of the patterns of climate change politicization among publics. So we have the following research questions we're going to address. So to what extent has climate change worry changed in Europe since 2016-2017? Has the association between climate worry and left-right self-placement increased? Has the magnitude of the association between climate worry and voting behaviour been greater for left-wing than right-wing parties? And finally, is any observed politicization of climate change worry greater in Western than Central and Eastern Europe, where observed politicization has previously been less noticeable? So we have various theoretical approaches to why we expect certain outcomes. So among political elites, we think that there's greater incentives for left parties to emphasize climate change action policies during times of high salience. So there are two main reasons for this. Firstly, left parties in general have a greater ideological affinity with environmental issues over the past few decades. So therefore, it should be easier for them to incorporate climate change into their programmatic appeal compared to parties on the right. Moreover, mainstream left parties, such as social democratic parties, may increase their odds of entering into coalition governments by doing so, because if the issue is one that they feel that they can do stronger on, and it's one that resonates with the public, then this may take votes away from right parties who are less able to do so without losing some of their base, while giving them more options to be more compatible with, say, Green parties or central parties who have climate change as an important part of the agenda. And an example of this, for instance, is in 2019, as the picture here demonstrates, in the UK general election, there was a TV debate organised for debating climate change, in which 7 of the political party leaders were invited. Yet the leaders of the Conservative and the Brexit Party at the time didn't show up, while those on the other side of the spectrum did. Now, publics may respond to such shifts, we believe, in two ways. So firstly, if climate change isn't something that they had talked much about previously, and their preferred party are concentrating particularly on this, then publics may update their climate attitudes to match those of their preferred party. So this may be increased worry if this is what the party are putting out there, whereas they may be less worried about it if the party that they support are of the view that it's not so important. Moreover, if voters are already convinced that climate change should be prioritized as a result of the various increase in salience that occurred, then they should be more likely to switch their vote to parties that prioritize climate change if it's the case that their existing party does not. And so we think that the more left parties emphasize climate change in comparison to right parties, the more likely it is for the issue to become more incorporated into left-right identification. So to do this, we use data from both the ESS round 8 that we've already heard about, as well as data from the recent round 10, which repeated some of these questions for the first time. So we have 15 countries from Western Europe and 6 from Central and Eastern Europe that were asked in both waves of the survey. And furthermore, while Israel was also asked in both waves, we do exclude it because their party system is quite different. And so for the purposes of our study, it's not so comparable. As to the questions we use, we concentrate primarily on how worried individuals are about climate change on a 1 to 5 point scale. We look at the party they voted for in the last general election in their country, and we use this to code the parties into party families based on versions of existing schema. And then we also look at left-right self-placement in terms of whether on a 0 to 10 scale, individuals think of themselves more as left or right. We also could have a number of political values to account for, and these are whether individuals think government should reduce income differences, attitudes towards adoption for gay and lesbian couples, and views towards immigration. So on that note, I'll now pass you over to Steve, who will talk through our results.
Hello, thank you, John. So on this slide, what we see is a simple sort of bar charts with the percentage who are very or extremely worried about climate change. At the top, you've got 2016, 2017. At the bottom, you've got the more recent data, 2020 to 2022. The most obvious point is that the bars are bigger on the bottom graph. The overall level of worry has gone up. It's not gone up in every country, but it's gone up in nearly every country. You can see the Eastern European, Central and Eastern European countries are in green, and at the top, they're a bit more concentrated on the right-hand side with lower levels of worry. In the bottom, by 2020 to 2022, they're more spread out in the distribution. The other thing to notice about the two distributions is that the range from the most worried to the least worried countries has actually narrowed over these in the most recent wave. And so that to that extent, there's actually less difference between countries, and particularly for EU policy making, that might be an advantage for countries reaching common cause on climate policy makings if there's both higher levels of worry overall and less difference between countries in the extent to which the publics are worried about these problems. So we move on to the next slide. What we see here are the change from 2016-17 to 2020-22. And you can see the biggest changes on average are in the East European countries rather than the West European countries. And there's quite some variation in the change from nearly 25% in Austria to actually -1 percentage point in Iceland. Without going into too much detail, there's a little bit of a tendency for the change to be a bit bigger when countries started on lower levels. But that's not true for some northern and colder countries like Iceland. It is also the case that some that started with the highest levels of worry, like Spain and Portugal last time, have seen very little increase. So there's been some changes in the ordering of countries as according to which countries are most worried and which countries are least worried. Now, moving on. This shows you an ordered logit regression of climate change worry as the dependent variable on, in the first instance, just left-right identification, and the negative coefficient in the first model, and this is just Western Europe, shows you that in 2016, 2017, those who were on the right were less worried. And that's still true when we control for income egalitarianism, sexuality egalitarianism, and anti-extra EU migration. One key point for our previous paper was that the fact that there's some left-right identification effect here, even controlling for these other so-called second dimension, cultural dimension, Galtan dimension factors, means that the notion of being left is associated with climate change even after controlling for these other factors. Now, you can see that we've also got the corresponding models for 2020 to 2022, and the pattern of coefficients is basically the same, but the coefficients are a bit stronger, which means that that tendency for climate change to be linked to other attitudes, but also linked to left-right identification controlling for those other attitudes, is somewhat stronger now than it was back in 2016-17. If we turn now to the next slide, or the next part of this slide, we see that you've got a similar kind of replication of models for Central and Eastern Europe, but the coefficients are much weaker, and there hasn't been the same systematic change in the coefficients that we saw in Western Europe. Moving on to the next slide. Here we have a direct test with pooled data to see whether, as is highlighted in yellow, the change from the first wave, 1617 to 2022 is significantly, the change in the effect of left-right is significantly different in the second wave versus the first wave, and that's captured by this interaction term that's highlighted in yellow. And there you can see that in Western Europe, the interaction term is statistically significant, but it's not for Central and Eastern Europe, which confirms that the pattern of change we saw in the previous slide is actually significant. It's not just small changes in coefficients. Now, this table goes back to sort of basic summary statistics On the left-hand side, what you've got is the mean left-right position of voters for different political party families in 2016 and 17. And as you'd expect, voters for the Communists and the Greens and the Social Democrats have lower scores, meaning they think of themselves as more on the left, and the people voting for the Conservatives and Populist right have higher scores, meaning they think of themselves as more to the right. And then that ordering is kind of replicated broadly in climate change worry for 2016, 2017, with worry about climate change being higher for the left-wing party families than the right-wing party families. Now, we've also got the 2020 to 2022 figures there and the change in the diff columns. And if we go back to left-right on the left-hand side of this table, what you see is, broadly speaking, positive change at the bottom of the list and negative change at the top of the list, which means that left-wing parties are even more left-wing in terms of their voters are even more likely to think of themselves as left-wing than they did before. And right-wing parties have voters that are even more likely to think of themselves as right-wing than they did before, which is maybe a bit of movement and a bit of sorting, but it might also be that people's identities are changing when they stick with a party and they're beginning to think of themselves more on a political spectrum while keeping a consistent party linkage. We're not able to distinguish that between in these data. What we see on the right-hand side is that the change is much more positive at the top and positive but much more limited at the bottom, which essentially means that the Greens and the other left parties have voters that have become more worried about climate change. And that might be, again, it might be sorting, or it might be change for the same voters within those parties. But what is certainly clear is that the levels of worry on the left-wing parties, especially the Greens, are much higher now relative to the levels of worry for the Conservative and Populist right parties at the bottom of the list. If we turn now to the Central and Eastern European data, what we see is a much more mixed picture in terms of the linkage of party families to left-right identification, and also the differences between party families and worry, but there's a broadly similar pattern. When it comes to change, the change is much more inconsistent in terms of left-right identification and fairly modest, with relatively little change overall. But in terms of climate worry, the worry has increased much more substantially in Eastern Europe, as we saw from the bar charts. But the pattern of that change between party families is rather inconsistent. It's not significantly higher. In fact, it looks on balance a bit lower for the parties at the left at the top of these lists than it is for the parties at the right at the bottom of the list. If we move on now, we can see predictive margins plots from regression models. You can see on the x-axis of these graphs, you've got Greens left, Liberals right, Populist right, broadly in order of climate worry. And if you look at the grey lines and the maroon lines, you'll see they're sloping downwards on the left-hand side, which is 2016-17, and they're sloping downwards even more steeply on the right-hand side, which captures the idea that the differences between the party families on the x-axis are becoming wider with respect to climate worry, being very worried or extremely worried, and they're wider now than they used to be in 2016 and 2017. If we move on to the next graph, we have roughly the same thing, but this actually also includes controls for left-right self-placement and political values. And because we still see downward slopes on those grey and maroon lines, particularly on the right-hand side, and change from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, this shows us that that politicization between these party families is not fully captured by left-right self-placement and those other political values we talked about earlier. So in conclusion, and I'm sorry, I hope I haven't taken up too much time, main points to take away from this presentation are that climate worry has increased across Europe. It's not just the UK, as Wouter showed you in his presentation, the increase in climate worry in the UK. And that increase has actually been greater in Central and Eastern Europe than Western Europe. And that might be a good thing for EU policy making, to have that convergence at a higher level of concern in EU publics. Now, what is less good for climate policy making is political polarization, or politicization, as we call it, and the linkage of climate concern, climate worry with one side of the political spectrum. And that has become increasingly the case in Western Europe, with the climate worry being much more concentrated on the left, people who think of themselves as the left, and people who vote for left-wing parties. And so that is the second, and perhaps for national policy making, much more important things, that development that climate change is becoming more of a political football between left and right in national politics. And I will end there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you to both of you. That was an excellent paper, provoking many questions, certainly in my mind, and I hope amongst the rest of our audience. If you'd like to put some of those to John and Stephen, please use the Q&A function, and we will return to those at the end of the session. We've already got quite a few questions in the bank, so we'll certainly be have something to do at the end of the session. Thanks again, both. Our third paper today is from Thea Gregersen from Norway, and the title is Climate Change and Political Orientation in ESS Countries. So Thea, I offer the floor to you.
Thank you, and hi from Bergen, Norway. Now, I felt like I was a part of the Eurovision competition, introducing my country and everything, but yeah. Hi, I'm going to talk about the relationship between political orientation measured with the left-right placement, climate change beliefs, and climate change worry. And my presentation is based on this paper that you see here. It was published in 2020. We use data, of course, from round 8 of the European Social Survey. And the paper is written by me and several co-authors, including Wouter Poortinga, as you see here. This paper was also part of my PhD thesis, which is now done, finished. And the background for doing this study was my interest in political orientation as a predictor, especially for climate skepticism, and maybe even more how political orientation in the US had been found to moderate, for example, the effects of education on climate change beliefs. At the same time, we know that, as Wouter already mentioned, that climate change denial, or what we now call climate change skepticism, is changing. So especially trend skepticism, or denying that climate change is happening at all, is becoming more rare. And that is also the case for what we call attributional skepticism, denying that climate change is human caused. So the battle is not for climate change denial or these kind of climate change skepticism anymore. Most people in Europe agree with both of these facts, as we can call them, independent of their political orientation. But believing in these two things, that climate change is human caused and will have negative consequences, does that mean that climate change is something we should worry about? And does it mean that it's something we should prioritize politically, for example? What is the effect of believing these things? And is it the same for everyone? Well, we know that beliefs about human causes and negative consequences of climate change is related to how much people report to worry about it. And we thought that maybe since political orientation is the role of political orientation for climate skepticism is mainly explained with a process of motivated reasoning, meaning that you filter information in line with your existing beliefs or identity. You believe what you want to believe. We thought that maybe these basic climate change beliefs, believing in human causes and negative consequences, could have different effects or be related differently to worry based on your political orientation. So believing that is human caused and will have negative consequences might be more important for some people than for others when it comes to worry about climate change. So you might hold the same beliefs, but still be more or less worried about it. And now, of course, I talk about this as it is something that we can say something about causality, which we can't because it's a solely correlational study, of course. But the kind of the theoretical background and our thoughts going into this is, what I'm talking about now. So our main point there is the last question that you see on the screen. But before going into this moderation effect that we wanted to end up with, we had several other questions we wanted to answer on our way there. So first, since European Social Survey includes a range of different countries that can be quite different, we wanted to control for the effect of the country people live in. So the first question is, to what degree does the country you live in influence how worried you are about climate change? Secondly, as I just said, and everyone before me today, we already know that political orientation is a core variable in the US for a range of different climate attitudes. So the question we had was how important climate change beliefs are as opposed to political orientation in explaining worry about climate change in Europe or the European Social Survey countries. And climate change beliefs, that's kind of an umbrella term I use for beliefs about the causes and negative consequences of climate change. And finally, our main question was, does political ideology interact with climate change beliefs in explaining worry? Can your political orientation influence how you evaluate and emphasize your beliefs about human causes of climate change and negative impacts? So just as motivated reasoning can drive skeptical attitudes towards climate change, we thought that it might also influence people's levels of worry about it. And I think one thing that we could discuss a bit later, I feel like a lot of us today, the presenters, are talking about worry about climate change. And one question that might be interesting and important to discuss is what it means to be worried about climate change. When we use worry about climate change as an outcome, and especially as an outcome across a range of different countries, one question is, of course, whether worrying about climate change means the same thing in different countries. So maybe we could discuss that later. I will move on to our results. The first question was whether the country level is important for predicting worry. Does the country you live in influence how worried you are about climate change? And we find that it does. The interclass correlation is 6%, so it's not a huge impact in itself, but it does have an impact. And what we see here is the differences in worry between different countries from the overall mean. So we see that in round 8, Portugal and Spain were the two countries who were most worried about climate change, while we have Eastern European countries at the bottom here. And I can also mention that both in round 8 but also what we saw in the last presentation, Norway also seems to stand out a little bit as compared to some of the other countries, especially in the 2022 data that you were just shown in the last presentation. So I just want to mention that Norway is, of course, we have a highly educated population, whatever that means for worry about climate change. At the same time, skepticism towards the human causes of climate change is somewhat larger in Norway as compared to other countries we like to compare ourselves with. Of course, Norway is a bit shielded maybe from the worst effects of climate change, both due to the placement of Norway as a country, but also our good economy and a good welfare system. And we also have a very large oil industry and very big carbon footprints as compared to the general European citizen. So I'm just letting you know in case you get some thoughts about what it means to be worried about climate change and predictors of worry based on that information. Okay, so what we find then is that the country you live in matter, but it doesn't have a huge effect. We still continue with what we call multi-level regression models because it does have a certain effect that we wanted to control for. The next question was the relative contribution of different variables included in our model. And we find, interestingly enough, that in Europe, belief in human-caused climate change is the most important variable out of these three when we control for a range of different variables. And of course, it's quite interesting that believing in human-caused climate change has the most important effect, given that, of course, even though climate change in case it hadn't been caused by humans, the effects could still be horrible, right? You could still be cause for concern. So one question is why? Why is this belief in anthropogenic climate change so important? And one answer to that question we found in a current research. We have a paper under review now where we asked people in Norway why they answered that they are very worried about climate change or not at all worried about climate change or somewhat worried about climate change. And what we find then, it's an open-ended question. What we find then is that people who are not worried about climate change say that that's because they are skeptical towards the human causes of climate change. So it is a reason not to worry. But those who are highly worried about climate change don't talk about the causes of climate change. So it seems like it's beliefs about human causes is not really what makes people worried, but it's what makes them not worried. So maybe that's the explanation for this effect. Then we also have the effect of belief in negative impacts. That's the second most important variable. And most importantly here, of course, the ideology variable, left-right placement, has a much smaller effect compared to the two other factors. And of course, a much smaller effect than what we would expect if we run the same model in the US. So the next step was to check whether the relationship between political orientation and worry might differ between countries, because one explanation for a weak overall effect can be that the effect is quite different between different countries. And we had reason to believe that it would be, because previous research had already found that this to be true. So we accounted for this in our model by running a random slope on the relationship between political orientation and worry. And the graph here shows the mean slope of political orientation within the countries included in the European Social Survey. And as we see, the slope is mainly negative. Which means that if you place yourself further right, that means you're less worried. But we also see that there is some countries here at the top where the slope seems to be positive. And if I remember correctly, when looking specifically at these countries and these relationships, it's not statistically significant, but still it seems like there's something different happening in some of these countries. And had you remove these countries, the overall effect of political orientation would be stronger. And at the same time, on the at the bottom here, we see that some countries have a larger effect of political orientation as compared to other countries, and that includes UK, Norway, and Switzerland, and especially UK and Norway. Finally, what we really wanted to look at was this interaction effect or moderation effects that I talked about earlier. And what I must mention is that the effect we find is very small. And we do have like 40,000 individuals, so it's very easy to get a statistically significant effect. So it should be mentioned that this effect is quite small. The results show that those with stronger beliefs in human causes of climate change and negative consequences report higher levels of worry, independent of their political orientation. However, we do find that this relationship is somewhat stronger for those placing themselves further left on the political spectrum. So the relationship between climate change beliefs and worry is stronger for those with a left placement. And one question is, of course, whether we should have a random slope on the interaction, since we found a random slope on the direct effect. So this interaction could be different, of course, in different countries. And my only answer to that, why we didn't do that, is that it of course becomes very complex, a very complicated model. But I have found another paper also published in 2021, a bit later in 2021 in Nature, called Right-Wing Ideology Reduces the Effects of Education on Climate Change Beliefs in More Developed Countries. So maybe I can add it in the chat later. And they found specifically that the relationship between education and political ideology is different based on the country they are in. So we do find an effect of political orientation, but the effect is nowhere as strong as in the United States, and is quite different across different countries, even though it's mostly in the same direction. So then I wanted to take one step back and ask the question, why do we think that political orientation should have an effect? And of course, it's not necessarily a political orientation in itself, but what political orientation represents. So specifically here, we know that ideologies consist of a set of values, beliefs, and opinions. Right-leaning ideologies are generally related to a preference for social stability and tradition, while left-leaning ideologies are related to a preference for social change and progress. And there are some ideological aspects that has been highlighted as especially relevant with regards to climate change perceptions. Individualistic values, hierarchical values, and free market ideology. And one important question then is whether these aspects of political orientation or political worldviews are what we measure in all of these countries. So here are the measurement of political orientation. In politics, people sometimes talk of left and right. Where would you place yourself? And what we did find was that the missing observations on this question was much higher in post-communist countries. In Eastern and Central Europe, it's the same countries where political orientation doesn't have such a big effect. And that might mean first, that the left-right scale doesn't seem as relevant for these people. It's harder for them to place themselves, and that the left-right scale might measure something different in different parts of Europe. And some have highlighted that we can and maybe should distinguish between economic, social, and immigration-related conservatism. So while Northern Europe tend to be more progressive, or what we call left-leaning, on immigration and social issues, they tend to be more conservative on economic issues. So when answering the left-right scale, do you then answer based on economic, social, or immigration-related conservatism? So this might be one explanation why we don't really find the same effects. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not about identity in Europe. You just might need to measure something a bit different than placement on the left-right scale. And I see I have less than a minute left. I also wanted to highlight that another explanation for the finding is what Hornsey wrote in 2018, that the effect of political orientation seemed to be stronger in countries with large fossil fuel industries. For example, in Norway, that's kind of supported in our data, and countries with high per capita emissions. Again, Norway. They suggest that one reason for cross-country differences is that right-leaning ideologies are not inherently linked to climate skepticism. Instead, the entanglement of fossil fuels industries in the economy and required lifestyle changes, vested interest, drive the effect of ideology in some countries. So that might be an additional explanation. And since I'm running out of time, I'm going to end it there, and I look forward to our discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you very much there. That was fascinating. Again, excellent stuff. And again, lots of questions, I think, stimulated by that presentation. I will sit patiently on mine until 20 to 3. If you have a question, any kind of query related to Thea's paper, please use the Q&A function, and we will be coming to those at the end of the session. Thanks, Thea. Our fourth paper this afternoon is from Malcolm Fairbrother at Umeå University. His provisional title is Political Trust and the Relationship Between Climate Change Beliefs and Support for Fossil Fuel Taxes. Malcolm, you've got the floor.
Okay. Are you seeing my slides?
We are, thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm a political sociologist at Umeå University in northern Sweden. I'm also a professor at the University of Graz in Austria and a researcher at the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm, which is where I'm speaking to you all from today. If I look a little strange, it's because I'm having extreme seasonal allergies. We're in the middle of pollen season here in Sweden, and it hits me hard every year, and especially this year. So if I look like a vampire, that's why. I'm going to talk today about this paper that I worked on with colleagues at Umeå based on the 2016 ESS data. And this paper, as you can see, came out in Global Environmental Change in late 2019. But I thought I would sort of preface my presentation of the highlights of this just with one or two quick sort of broader observations. I'm originally from Western Canada, and being based in northern Sweden in particular, I really feel the contrasting outcomes of different national decisions with respect to greenhouse gas emissions very keenly. So Sweden is not doing enough on climate change, like no country in the world is actually doing enough. But there are countries in the world that are performing far better than others. And, you know, for example, Canada is an embarrassment. There's a whole spectrum of different levels of performance on climate change. And the way I see, for example, the conversations we're having today is ultimately, you know, we ultimately need to try to understand this picture and understand why it is that societies make the decisions they do that have the consequences we care about for the climate. I also want to say that when I was a kid, the most scary environmental problem in the world was not climate change. It was the thinning of the ozone layer. And I think it's really important to keep in mind, for example, we solved that problem. So if you went back 30 or 35 years, this climate change and maybe acid rain would have been the world's 3 most sort of serious environmental challenges at that time. And to a large degree, we've solved 2 of them. So climate change is kind of intriguing in the sense that we've known about it scientifically for a very long time, but the world has made, you know, abysmally kind of little progress in dealing with it, with some caveats that some countries have done better than others. But I think it's important to kind of keep our eye on the ball that sometimes societies do, in fact, find ways to solve these kinds of problems. In general, in fact, I would say when we try, we succeed. We sometimes just don't try. And so the big question, I think, is why is it that on climate change, societies vary so much in the degree to which they try, and in a sense, no society is trying that hard? So here's my general sort of mental model or theoretical model of where climate policy decisions come from. Social movements play a role in, I think, taking scientific concerns into the public domain. I think industry lobbying, particularly by fossil fuel industries and fossil fuel companies, has been extremely influential. Politicians, bureaucrats, scientists allied with the state all play a role, political parties. But of course, working with survey data, I'm going to really focus today on the influence of public attitudes. And so what I try to do with what I tried to do with these colleagues with the ESS data is sort of unpack this influence on the political decisions that ultimately, do or don't save the earth. Now, I should say that there are all kinds of different ways that societies need to transform, and in some cases are in fact transforming. And in Europe, I think, we have the world's greatest, most ambitious set of package of climate policies, underway. And we, a lot of people haven't even heard about this, but the Fit for 55 package is the European Union's plan for how to actually achieve its extremely ambitious climate targets for 2030. And this package of policies encompasses, a lot of different things. So just transition assistance for workers who lose their jobs because of new environmental policies, carbon tariffs or taxes levied on imports of goods coming into the European Union, obviously controversial for other reasons, but nuclear power, sectoral, efficiency regulations for things like transport and buildings are actually extremely important. And, a really big one that's kind of fascinating is the end of the internal combustion engine. I mean, that's basically in European Union policy at this point. And if we are to sort of do what it takes to achieve net zero, we will simply have to have cars, powered by something very different than these repeated explosions we've been using for the last 100 years. Foreign assistance or climate finance for poorer countries is potentially quite important. Protection of forests and biodiversity, to some extent a separate issue, but also tied to climate change. And then raising the price of pollution to the polluter by taxing the combustion of fossil fuels is, of course, extremely important. It ultimately doesn't matter how many green technologies we use if they are accompanied by continued massive emissions of greenhouse gases. And so fundamentally, the great challenge is to find a way to get us to stop emitting greenhouse gases. And one of the most important tools we have for that is taxation. It's not the only tool, but it is in fact the only one we really have a good question about in the ESS. And so this is what I focused on in this paper. Now, the angle I want to take on this draws a little bit of inspiration from the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vests movement that, of course, was quite a big deal in France before the pandemic in 2019, also spread to other countries in Europe in a variety of ways. And I don't want to get totally hung up on the specifics of the Gilets jaunes phenomenon, but I think there's an interesting general lesson to be drawn from these protests, which is, and there's been research on this movement to show it, most people who participated in the Yellow Vests protests believed in climate change. And as we've seen in other presentations here, no matter which kind of survey you look at from anywhere in the world now, the ESS data or otherwise, we've won the war globally to convince people about the reality of dangerous anthropogenic climate change. But what we haven't done is convince people to support some of the solutions, like, for example, taxing fossil fuels. The Yellow Vest protests were in response to, I think, a very poorly designed policy. But the general principle here is you can believe in the problem, but not trust in the solutions. So let me just show you what we did with the ESS data to kind of work with this general theme. The policy question which we focused on in the 2016 ESS data set was this one. To what extent are you in favor or against the following policies in your country to reduce climate change? And one of the ones was increasing taxes on fossil fuels. Then we also, what we wanted to do was relate this question, the tax support question, to an index that we constructed based on responses to these three questions about the reality of dangerous anthropogenic climate change. Do you think the Earth's climate is changing? Is that due predominantly to natural processes, human activity, or about both equally? And how bad do you think this will be? But what I'm going to sort of try to convince you of is that actually this part is extremely important as well, political trust. So what I think you see in the Gilets jaunes protests, and as I'll show you in a minute, what I think we can see in the ESS data, is that whether you support governments doing things to address social problems, including but not only climate change, depends a lot on how you see policymakers, public administrators, political and public administration institutions. And if you don't have confidence that these people are reasonably honest, they do their jobs competently, they're not too corrupt, then it doesn't matter if you're worried about climate change. You're not going to support them doing things because they would be ineffective anyway. So here's the distribution of responses to the three questions about beliefs. So as we've seen, the vast majority of people in Europe, based on the ESS data, believe climate change is happening. Not quite so much, support for the proposition that this is a predominantly anthropogenic phenomenon, which of course science shows that it is. But generally speaking, skepticism that it's at least as much humans as nature is pretty strong. And then, people are pretty convinced that climate change will be bad. But here's the distribution of responses on a 5-point scale to the support for higher fossil fuel taxes question. And here what you can see is there's very few people at the high end, with strongest support, despite the fact that economists would tell us this is the most effective and cost-effective way of reducing pollution. The public is not that keen on higher taxes on fossil fuels. There's, some people at the 2s and 3s, not very many at 4s, quite a lot at 0s and 1s, as you can see. If we take the average response to the climate change belief index, comprising the three items which I've talked about on the horizontal axis here, and then we graph the country average against the average response to the fossil fuel tax question on the vertical axis here, what you can see are two key things I want you to take away from this graphic. One, belief in climate change is pretty high everywhere. So this is basically a 1 to 6 index. And as you can see, every country's average is somewhere between 4 and 5, so fairly high. And there is no pattern, there is no correlation between the average level of belief about climate change in these 23 countries and the average level of support for higher taxes on fossil fuels. There's no, if you try to draw a line through these dots, you're not going to get very far. But if we unpack these country averages and take the average support for higher taxes for each unique possible value of climate change belief by country, which is what I'm showing you here now, what we can start to see is that there are countries where no matter whether you believe in anthropogenic climate change or not, you don't support higher taxes on fossil fuels. So it's very clear with Poland at the bottom, even people who have the highest level of climate change belief don't want higher taxes on fossil fuels. Whereas there are countries where logically, if you don't believe much in climate change, you don't support fossil fuel taxes. But if you do believe in climate change, then you are pretty likely to strongly support higher taxes on fossil fuels. And we can see that with the Nordic countries and Switzerland at the top. The line is quite upward sloping from left to right. So here you can see just a different version of what I showed you before. There's almost no correlation between the average level of climate change belief in a country and the average support for fossil fuel taxes. But look at this one. Average political trust on the horizontal axis and average support for increased taxes on fossil fuels on the vertical axis Across the 23 countries, the correlation is 0.86. Now, in the social sciences, a correlation of 0.86 is about as strong as you ever get, I think. And so this is, I think, very dramatic evidence that, if we want to understand why it is that some societies end up being more supportive of, at least this key policy measure to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, it's actually very much about people's confidence in political institutions. I should note that even in relatively high political trust societies like Norway or Switzerland, you can see here, it's not that high. So this is a 0 to 10 scale, and there's no country that even gets to 6. So political distrust is pretty widespread, and in some ways that's good. I mean, we don't want to be gullible. We don't want to be overly trusting in, political actors who, we should have a little healthy skepticism about. But I think the political distrust that you can see represented in this picture in many countries is in fact a major impediment to a successful resolution of the climate crisis. So in the paper, we have some multi-level models, and here I'm just going to show you the sort of graphics of the predictions that come out of these models. So again, climate belief is on the horizontal axis here. And if we just sort of plot the predicted probability of offering support, reporting support for a higher fossil fuel tax, here you can see that in a low trust country, there's almost no relationship between, again, climate change belief and your support for this policy action, whereas in a high trust country, there's quite a strong relationship. So that sort of orangey reddish line is quite sloping. And that interaction effect also holds at the individual level. So again, not just sort of depending on the political trust of the country, but even the political trust of the individual. The interaction effect is not so strong. You can see here the slopes of the lines are not so different, but this is still a statistically significant interaction effect. So I'm just going to stop with another broader observation. People have mentioned Greta Thunberg a couple times today. I think Greta Thunberg is totally amazing. I think she's been a fantastic sort of advocate for taking the climate crisis as seriously as it should be taken. But there's one thing I think is problematic about Greta Thunberg's sort of general take on the world, and the message is, to her, she emphasizes it's all blah, blah, blah. Nobody's doing anything. Politicians have failed. And this, New York Times cartoon kind of makes the point. She's totally given up on politicians. And I think that's a problem, because if we really don't expect anything, we won't get anything. And so I think the difficulty with something like the climate crisis is we need to hold two thoughts that are kind of contradictory, but we need to hold them simultaneously. So the first thought is that governments have failed. I mean, politicians have not done enough, and we have reason to be angry about that. But on the other hand, we have to expect more. We have to believe that they will, in fact, if we push them in the right way, eventually solve this problem. Because if we don't believe that, I worry that we'll just sort of descend into cynicism, political distrust, a lack of confidence that anybody will solve this problem, and then we won't get a resolution. And so I hope I've convinced you that these sorts of broader outlooks people have on society about whether we can be confident that political institutions, public administration institutions and leaders do what they say is an extremely important part of this. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Malcolm. That was terrific. Another excellent paper there, and I'm sure that will have stimulated more questions. If you've got questions on Malcolm's presentation, please put them in the Q&A as we're moving closer ever towards the end of the session. So thanks once again. So our final paper of the afternoon in this slot is from Cameron Brick, who's at the University of Amsterdam. The title is Segmentation of ESS Climate Change Beliefs and Related Projects. Cameron, are you? Yeah, there you go. And the slides are there. You have the floor, sir.
Well, it's lovely to be here with everyone. Thank you for having me. And I've actually just accepted a partial-time second job at the Inland Norway University of Applied Sciences in Lillehammer. So Thea and Norwegian colleagues, look forward to connecting more with you. So the beginning of the talk, and the reason I'm here, of course, is because we use the ESS for some of our recent projects. And I want to just first say, I love this resource. It is expensive. You can tell from how high quality the work is that's in it, the work that went into both wording the questions like Wouter was talking about, as well as the sample size and quality. So I think this is a critical resource. I've really learned a lot from it, some of which has ended up in papers. We were struggling to try and do the individual looking at individual variables and get a sense about what we should conclude from the patterns. We weren't sure which of these kinds of variables in the climate change module were of greatest interest to us, and some of the patterns were contradictory. And because of that, we decided to take on a segmentation approach, like a grouping, where instead of we're looking at the kind of high-low item level relationships, we would be looking at groups of people. So that's what I'm going to be telling you about. And here are the items that we used, which were just a broad set of items. And this allowed us to not need to pick which one, instead to allow to combine all of them and try and see if there are groups of people that seem to be represented by these. Skipping right to the main point. Here is what we found. We found that a 4-class solution fit the latent class analysis best across all of these countries and Israel. And it wasn't guaranteed that it would converge at all. These models sometimes don't work, or they don't have really good evidence to support a certain set of classes versus others. But we actually found a pretty convincing solution statistically, which is why we then went ahead and labeled these categories. Now, the labels is probably the most artistic aspect of this. It's not possible to take 15 items and their patterns and reduce them to a single word. But to have a shorthand version of it, those are what we called them. And you can see that across Europe, the biggest category is indifferent. One point here to notice is that we didn't see evidence for a important separate dismissive group, full of deniers, in the same way that is pretty visible in the 6 Americas segmentation in the United States. They do exist, but they don't seem to be large or distinct enough to form their own group. So here's what the results would look like if you drill down into some of the individual questions. We've seen other presenters here talking about, do you think the world's climate is changing? And I just want to point out 2 things for you in this top panel. One is that over here to the right, do you see the doubtful group? Even the doubtful group overwhelmingly thinks that the climate is definitely changing or probably changing. So we have, even at 2016, I think in Europe, moved beyond this question of, is it happening? And now we have to move on to why is it happening and what should we do about it? The other thing I want you to see in the top panel is that the engaged and pessimistic, the first 2 groups, look really, really similar, which I'm going to return to in a second. And you see that same pattern in the lower left. So the second question, climate change caused by natural processes, human activity or not? And we see that the engaged and pessimistic look quite similar. But where they don't look similar is the efficacy items that Wouter showed earlier. So here are some of these items, like how confident are you that you could use less energy? How likely is it that governments are going to take enough action to reduce climate change? Now we see that the engaged and the pessimistic group look quite different. So this is probably the pattern that's driving them ending up in different segments. And it made us think, okay, maybe efficacy is one of the core things that is distinguishing how people are responding, even if they hold, let's say, even if they are reporting the same kind of belief about climate change. Yep, so that is refocusing on efficacy. These are the results for the segmentation across all of the different countries. You can find your country of interest over there on the left and look at the proportion of segments. For example, the Netherlands, 2/3 of the way down, where I spend most of my time, is a pretty large indifferent group, but not all that off of the average. I do want to say we need to take caution with the pooled 4-class model, because it wasn't true that in every individual country, the LCA with the greatest model fit had 4 groups, sometimes 3, sometimes 5. It's just that across the entire sample, the 4-cluster group works best. And we think it's a little bit difficult to like if I were to show you different LCAs for every single country, it makes it kind of unworkable. But what it means is that our advice is best suited for Europe-wide thinking about intervention or messaging or state of affairs, and a little bit less suited to any particular country, although it wouldn't be the case that the 4-class model would fit terribly, just that it might be similar or slightly worse than an alternative model, depending on the country. So attitudes have changed since 2016, as we saw in some of the other presentations, and we wanted to recently test whether that was just, just everyone going up, just main effect of increase, or whether that would change the group structure that we observed. And this is work in progress, so with a grain of salt, I just am here to report that we don't seem to be able to test the latent class analysis on the latest release of data. There weren't as many climate items in round 10, and there was some experiment about how many response scale items were on different questions. And so maybe LCA isn't the best approach for answering this in the latest data. That's our quick takeaway. So that's where we are at with it at the moment. Because of the focus on efficacy I mentioned earlier, I want to highlight this recent paper of ours led by Marijn Meijers here at the University of Amsterdam, where we talk about many different kinds of efficacy. It's not so simple to distinguish when people feel personally able to do something versus when they think the government is able, or other issues like that. And in this paper, we distinguish between those efficacy subtypes, but also in their relationship to different kinds of pro-environmental behavior. I published one other ESS project, so just to very briefly mention it, this actually came out of a bachelor's thesis, a really exceptional bachelor's thesis, that's rare. And it was to try and look at cultural cognition, which was mostly investigated in the US, this idea that we could find where people are in these 2 dimensions I'm showing you on the right, and that would help determine answers like belief in climate change. But we don't see much evidence for cultural cognition in Europe in 2016. So this was, I think, a high quality, kind of conceptual replication of that line of work. And I didn't see a lot there, which led us to think, okay, this isn't the most useful approach to try and predict people's beliefs and behaviors. And in parallel to that, I had been working with another scholar, Aaron Sparks, who we were looking at the scales to measure pro-environmental attitudes, such as the connectedness to nature scale. Maybe some of you have used that, or the new ecological paradigm. And we found that these scales are kind of worded like someone from the political left. At least they sound so to me. Items like here, this one, like a tree is part of a forest, I feel part of the broader natural world. To me, that sounds really hippie. So we were wondering, how would we go about measuring environmental attitudes that would better represent, a full diversity of political positions? And we came up with this moral environmentalism scale using a dictionary method. We have now recently been applying it to predict consequential pro-environmental behavior. But the quick takeaway is just, here's a scale, it's freely available. And it seems to capture a little bit better variance in the low end. So for people who are pretty low in environmentalism, this scale has a little bit better quality as provided by the RASH model that we applied to its validation. In the last part of the talk, I want to share with you a little bit about our work predicting pro-environmental behavior. So this isn't from the ESS, but just as an introduction to our lab, and which is expanding. We're hiring another PhD and a postdoc this fall. We have been studying all kinds of different frequency of pro-environmental behaviors to try and boost conservation and help governments react quickly to the threat of climate change and biodiversity crises. And I think a big separation from how this work used to be done, and by me, was that instead of starting with something like the theory of planned behavior, we take as our starting point what is part of the public discussion already, the sustainable development goals, the physical processes that are underlying what transitions are necessary. This is a little bit awkward for a psychologist, at least an old school social psychologist in the vein I was trained in. But it's really beneficial because it helps you stay on target with things that everyone else cares about outside of your own discipline. And for any psychologists that want to learn more about how we can make a difference in our own teaching, research, and organization, the APA's report here in the lower right was actually quite good. I was impressed by that. I wasn't an author on that. One of my favorite papers in this area in the last while is by Christian Nielsen, who's in Copenhagen now at the business school. And he wrote this paper suggesting that people of high socioeconomic status have a particularly large influence on greenhouse gas emissions. That won't be a surprise to you. But I think the main thing to keep in mind here is that the vast majority of work on pro-environmental behavior has been on consumer behavior, what you're buying and not buying. But we have all of these other roles. For example, at work, we do some catering for an event, or what is the policy about whether we fly around to give talks, or those sorts of things. And every kind of organization has these decisions to make. And as citizens, we can participate. It's voting, it's protest, it's investing. And we overlook some of these additional roles. And there's a particular responsibility for those of high SES. And that includes most of us. So zooming out again to the pro-environmental behavior, we know that there's a problem with these scales where people report what they're doing, because self-reported pro-environmental behavior only explains about 20% of the variance in objective behavior. So we say, okay, these measures are highly statistically reliable, like using Cronbach's alpha or some kind of factor analysis, but we don't know what they are actually measuring. So we would say there's a validity problem here. It's mostly, by the way, not a question of low validity, just validity not even measured. So in our work, we're trying to tease out how should we be measuring pro-environmental behavior. And up on the upper right here, I've put in the theory of planned behavior again, where a lot of people seem to be publishing papers that are trying to get the link between intention and behavior as strong as possible to minimize the attitude behavior gap or the intention behavior gap. I would suggest to you that over time, we now have created a different problem for ourselves. Those links are too strong. We have made choices such that in the classical approach, the way that the attitudes, the intentions, and the behaviors are measured are all really, really similar, like answering Likert-style questions 1 to 7 with slight variations of wording. And which items are we selecting? Well, it's the ones that are easiest to measure, and we measure them on some sort of vague frequency that doesn't tie into, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we look for behaviors that are frequent and follow a Gaussian distribution. And that really limits the applicability of the work, I would suggest. It also reduces the validity we were just talking about. And I don't mean to criticize any of the work, with a looking down at approach. I mean, also all of my previous work that does this. This is exactly where I started. We're just trying to look at what to do next. I'm going to suggest to you that the alternative is an impact-based approach where you look at specific behaviors and you measure them in physical units, like liters of water consumed, kilowatt hours of energy, kilograms of CO2. And it still can be done with self-report. It's just that you get a lot more specific and you can't aggregate across 50 different behaviors simultaneously. I think this is consistent with Florian Kaiser's work with the Campbell paradigm and other people who are observing that the self-reported behaviors that we wanted to measure seem to be behaving more as attitude objects. So Christian again and a team of us published a few years ago this case for impact-oriented environmental psychology. It was a little bit controversial. There was a reply comment from some senior scholars who disagreed. But the argument, just to offer it to you, was that we suggested that we first identify behaviors with high impact, then we map the context and actors, including the non-psychological determinants, such as income, for example. Maybe income is the best predictor in some setting of whether you do a behavior or not, and efficacy not so important. Then you extend other behaviors, synthesize and theorize. It's a little bit more inductive, and I think sometimes this approach is appropriate. So I would say one or the other, the self-reported classic approach or the impact approach, both are important and they are compatible and valuable. But the thing is, they're not exchangeable. So how a resident might think about frequent pro-environmental actions is just not a good proxy for how they actually use resources in their household. We have to match the outcome measure to the research question and be a little bit less ready. You know, I have reviewed a ton for the Journal of Environmental Psychology, and it is every intro paragraph is, you know, look at climate change as such a global issue. And then if you go straight to the self-reported, how people are thinking about and relating to some frequent items, then that doesn't tack on well to the original story. As an example of this, a more recent paper, we looked at what predicts pro-environmental clothing-related behaviors in 4 countries. And we contrasted the environmental apparel scale, which is a classic self-reported scale, like items, I buy clothing made from organically grown natural fibers. And what was unusual about this is that we included a greenhouse gas emissions measure from the purchasing and washing. This is a technique from ecology called life cycle assessment, and it's fairly difficult, so which is why it hasn't appeared in the literature much. And what we did is we looked at these 2 outcomes and we tried to predict them from a really broad range of psychological predictors, like the ones we've been talking about: goals, self-efficacy, concerns, intentions, norms, you know, all the big ones. Here's the results. On the y-axis is the strength of the correlation, and each dot is one of the psychological predictors. So I'm only showing you the results for the classic self-report scale, the environmental apparel scale about clothing use. And you can see that the people who are more concerned, who see more social norm, who have more efficacy, they are reporting more clothing-related pro-environmental behaviors. That is sort of indicative of the main part of the literature. But what's surprising is that the actual greenhouse gas emissions from their jeans and t-shirt purchasing, which seem mostly driven by the amount that they were purchasing rather than the type or the location or the organic fibers or whatever, is not very well predicted by this. And a sharp viewer will notice it's actually in the wrong direction. Like someone who has more concern should have lower greenhouse gas emissions, but if anything, they're slightly positive. So there's some sort of validity problem with this self-reported scale, we think, and possibly a bunch of the other ones, including the ones that I have published in the past. So we don't know which pro-environmental behaviors are well predicted by psychological factors because we haven't been using measures of impact, you know, orienting to the most important behaviors and measuring them directly. And when intentions and attitudes decouple from impact, we have to choose which outcome we want to prioritize for testing our psychological theories. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. It depends on the context and the theory, but it should be thoughtful. So I'm almost done. Just to point out that we have been trying to do some of the work that I'm calling for. This, for example, is a field study using household water use where we never surveyed the people at all. We just sent them a persuasive message and then measured whether they used less water by partnering with the water utility. Giant pain in the ass to manage this collaboration with these outside partners, but I think worth it. And you can also do this not just with household behavior, but Anna here is now doing a PhD in Italy. And I just want to say that in this project, we managed to do objective measurement of people's participation in some activism groups. So that is also possible, even in the registered report format like it is here. So to wrap up, I recommend using open free data, the ESS, a bunch of other data. You can find these slides in this link on OSF. And I am now an associate editor and encourage all of you to submit work to the Journal of Global Environmental Psychology, which is free for authors to publish in and free for readers. And accepts a wide range of work, not just the conservation work I've talked about, but also nature exposure and the other aspects of environmental psych. It has two main goals. Open science is a strong practice, which means you don't have to have done things perfectly, just say what you did. So transparency is the point, and diversity in the authors, samples, and methods. Thank you to the many groups that are funding the research in our group. We've been very fortunate this past year, and thank you very much. That's it for me.
Thank you, Cameron. That was fascinating and excellent synthesis of quite a wide variety of published work. It was personally very, very interesting to me. So we're now at about 20 to 3. So we have time for a section of questions and answers. So some of these questions I noticed have already been answered live by one or two of the presenters. I'm reliably assured that everybody can publicly see these. So if you cannot see the answered questions in the Q&A function, do ping something in the chat very quickly and I will reprise them. But some of the questions have been asked directly. There are, however, some outstanding items. So there was a specific one for the John Kenny and Stephen Fisher paper. Nick Allen from Essex said that the tables where you had the left-right means and on the left and the amount of worry on the right, he said he'd really like to have seen that as a scatter plot. So if you'd like to correspond directly with Professor Allen at the University of Essex, that would be terrific, and CC me as well, because I'd like to see that plot. I've got some slightly more general observations that I think I might like to put to all the panelists, because one of the things that's really very much struck me this afternoon is how there's very much lots of interweaving of the work that's being done by the different scholars in this session, and there are lots of sort of connected questions. So there'll have to be fairly punchy answers to keep us within the time, but I would ask each of the panel to sort of chip in and give their responses to some of my broad brush questions. So the thing I'd start off with is a question that is raised in the Q&A actually by my colleague Rory Fitzgerald, who's now had to leave the webinar, and it basically points to this thing that quite a few of you point up, which is the potential for a polarization in the sort of views towards climate change, and with that a sort of potential political capture or political ownership of an issue by a section of the parties or those placing themselves on left-right. And is this not something of a danger in an area where is really sort of crying out for some kind of consensus in terms of policy formation? So I wonder if people would like to offer their observations. Maybe I'll start in chronological order and ask Wouter if he'd like to make any observations on that.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it short, but here I think we need to make a distinction between let's say differences between political parties and polarization and politicization. So if you're looking at the data in the UK, there's always been a difference between, let's say, the Conservative Party and Labour, and of course the Green Party, further down the line. But we don't have any evidence that it's further polarizing, over the years. So there's no evidence that it's becoming more politicized as such. What is important, though, is that we have to try to avoid politicization at any cost. There needs to be an agreement across all parties that this is the most important issue that needs to be addressed. And the moment it gets politicized, it will undermine that effort.
Thanks. John and Steve?
Maybe I can come in. So I think short answer is I think yes, I think there's a danger. So especially on the point that I've made on party polarization, I think what we've seen in the US is what has happened where it's gone to the extremes, if you will, is that there's can be some impacts of some negative partisanship where rather than even thinking the cue of the party you prefer is the one you follow, you think the party you dislike is, is in favor or against climate change, and that can also lead to extra problems. So both the kind of positive, the positive cues, but also the cues coming from parties you dislike. And I think there's also comes into kind of distrust as well with the political systems, as we've also followed. So I think short answer, it is a danger. I think it is something we need to pay careful attention to.
Thank you. Thea?
Yes, thank you. We actually try to get some money for researching this, so we'll see if we if we can get something from Norway. So what we were thinking, writing about this, is that what we see now is, of course, more and more climate measures are being implemented, and it's happening. Like, to reach the international agreements, we have to be much stricter on measures, and maybe people can't do exactly what they want to do anymore, and we are afraid that that will kind of fuel polarization and create a more polarized society. And what we also see is that smaller parties are rising, political parties. In Norway, we had this anti-toll roads party, and as a reaction to increases in toll roads in Norway. And one question is, of course, how these small parties will affect democracy and democratic processes in the cities and in the state, because they are often like one issue parties. So we're also wondering, especially are we moving from opinion polarization to a more effective polarization, and then less trust in the general political system and democratic processes?
Thanks, that's a very interesting point. Malcolm, would you like to add anything on this?
I mean, I think, it happened, right? So I raised the question of why the world hasn't solved climate change already. And if you roll back the clock 30 or 35 years, I mean, scientists basically said the same things about climate change they said about the ozone layer, like, there's some known chemical processes here, we should change the way we do things. And the world said yes to changing on this issue and no to changing on this issue. And I think, in broad brushstrokes, that's because the fossil fuel industry basically politicized the issue and generated, a lot of confusion in public debate in key countries, which spread to other countries, and we're only sort of now extricating ourselves from. I'm intrigued by the suggestion that this has gotten more politicized in terms of being more polarizing in the last few years. But, the UK, for example, passed the Climate Change Act in 2008. That was a huge piece of legislation with major consequences. I think it was a real achievement. The UK, had some polarization around this issue then, but as Wouter was saying, I'm not sure it's really changed that much. And I think, the mainstream of the Conservative Party is still basically on board with climate action, but maybe you all based in the UK can correct me if I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, I think one of the stimuluses behind Rory's question was that there's a sense in which the Brexit issue has sort of started from one that was possibly based on, whether you thought it was a good idea to stay in the EU or come out. But as it's become sort of an identity position almost, people who hadn't possibly even really had much of a position about the EU prior to 2016, when they see that people who they naturally feel opposed towards wanted to leave, they think, well, actually, I'm a Remainer. So it almost a sort of, it becomes based on sort of, which side of what do the people you don't like want to do about issue X, rather than the merits of the issue. So I think that's a sort of quite interesting point in the UK. Okay, Cameron, on this issue about politicization / polarization.
Yeah, I do see one small thing here I want to say, which is there is no single message that will succeed on all of the different groups. For example, the segments. We want to have some sort of ideal message that leads to consensus and action, but I suspect there is no such thing, and that there is some context, country, group level, meaningful variation that is going to lead to different strategies, either to boost pro-environmental behavior or to lead to attitude and identity overlap. I think that as the horrors of climate change become more daily and visible and economically painful, this will actually get much more difficult because there will be much more fuel for the anti-policy parties, whatever sort of painful policies are now coming up because we didn't do the work we needed to 30 years ago. So it is probably a good idea to continue to pay attention.
Okay, thanks very much for all those responses. I'd now like you all to respond to a slightly different stimulus, which is to look forward, really, in terms of how we take the analysis further and how we try and provide the best resources for people who are interested in researching attitudes to climate and environmental change. So I'm going to ask you each, and I'll go in reverse order, so we'll stay with you, Cameron, this time. I'd like you each to say a little bit about maybe 4 or 5 things that you would ideally love to see in future ESS in terms of variables that would help inform future work. So just as a prompt, one that I'm involved in a small way in a parallel project at the moment, looking at trying to import more contextual environmental data linked to particular geographies, because in a way, I suppose environmental awareness is a bit like, sort of fear of crime, more likely to be afraid of crime if someone's kicked your door in and stole your television. And so I guess, would knowing more about people's experiences of or exposure to climate change be useful? But don't let me lead you too far. You let us know, please.
Thanks for that question. 2 quick points. One is because the reported support for traditionally unpopular policies like new taxes seems to be relatively high, that really catches my eye and makes me think, well, maybe we could think about other wording of that question, or make people lead to some conflict about that, or explore it further, because I was quite surprised by that result. And the second piece, maybe consider some identity related questions that aren't political orientation or the classic demographics. For example, one of the strongest variables that I see related to all the other attitude, belief, concern, norms, messages, whatever, is whether someone sees themselves as an environmentalist. I don't quite know what that means across different countries. It is actually difficult to translate into Dutch and German. But whether it's that or some other identity, I think that would both lead to the polarization question and the patterns we're seeing, that it seems to be quite a central attitude object in some sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Going back through the order, Malcolm, would you like to suggest some areas we could look at?
I mean, I think something that I've been thinking about a lot is, in a sense, what are people's beliefs about, what it would take to actually solve the problem? Like, what do people perceive the scale of transformation in society to be if we were to genuinely tackle climate change? I think the sort of climate policy community thinks that, this is a big challenge. We need to do a bunch of things to change how we live. But in a sense, we don't necessarily need to fundamentally change our societies. We just need to decarbonize our economies. And that involves, changing how we generate electricity and using a lot more electricity rather than fossil fuels. But I have the impression the public somehow hears a message that climate change is such a gigantic problem. In a way they care, but in another sense, I think a lot of people are scared by like the cost of living impacts of a real climate transition. And I'm not sure we really have caught a great sort of way of capturing that semi-conscious kind of feeling on the part of the public. I also think there are a lot of really important public policy actions that have not been addressed in surveys at all, but certainly could be, very simple formulations of some policies that are certainly going to be important in the years to come could easily be added to surveys, I think, and we haven't really gone very far in figuring out how to do that, but I think it's very feasible.
Thank you. Thea, what would be on your variable shopping list?
Right now, I'm working quite a lot with open-ended questions. I don't know if the ESS is doing that at all. It's, of course, horrible to deal with after you collected the data, but I think it can give us some very important input. And what we find now is open-ended questions about what's behind or reasons behind why people are worried or angry or hopeful. They can be quite different. So maybe it doesn't make that much sense anymore to just ask, are you worried, are you hopeful, are you angry, because we need to differentiate between like sub groups of these emotions. So that would be one thing, open-ended questions, or maybe more about priorities, because even though people are still worried about climate change, it didn't change much during the pandemic. We see that other things are worrying people even more now, in Norway, health and the economy. So asking people to prioritize maybe between climate change and other things when voting, like what are your top 3 issues when voting?
Thank you. Coming to John and Stephen.
I'll chip in just quickly. Yeah, good question. I am always a fan of repeated measures over time. So top on my list of priorities would be keep asking the questions you've been asking before that work reasonably well, so that we can see how things are changing over time.
Good response. And so I'll leave the last word to Wouter then.
Yeah, I mean, the list is almost endless. There's so many things that I would want to include, but I really like Malcolm's suggestion, because the people, they are aware of the reality of climate change, and also, concern has increased massively, but I'm not sure that the public understands the degree of change that is needed. So I would like to see more about, let's say, transformative action, or questions on transformative action. So what kind of action is acceptable? What would they like to see? And in particular, what kind of action do people think are fair? Because that's one of the most important predictors of support for policy and action. And for example, taxation is seen by lots of people as unfair, and that can explain a lot of the opposition.
That's very interesting, that notion of sort of potential actions to be taken and judgments about fairness. That sort of echoes the sort of citizen assembly model lobbied for by groups like Extinction Rebellion and so on, doesn't it? On which note, it seems appropriate to leave that there. Can I offer a real heartfelt thanks to all the participants, all the paper givers today. There are 5 really stimulating, well executed and beautifully presented contributions, which have given me an enormous amount of small sticky notes for us to think about at ESS HQ. So thanks very much. And I finish, of course, by thanking everyone who's been online at some stage. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and you'll be able to see this in due course on our YouTube channel. So with that, I say thank you very much and good afternoon.